The opening monologue to the dark action adventure film Underworld describes humanity terrorized in a war between lichens, which are werewolves, and the vampires that hunt them. The heroine, Celine, calls herself a death dealer, which, as far as job titles go, is a pretty epic thing one could put on a business card. It is also a job title that popped into my head when Dr. Natasha Mikles mentioned the real job title of a death doula in our interview exploring her book, Shattered Grief: How the Pandemic Transformed the Spirituality of Death in America. Dr. Mikles is assistant professor of philosophy at Texas State University and specializes in popular rituals and narratives surrounding death. She is also co-chair of the American Academy of Religion's 5-year seminar on religion, monsters, and the monstrous. The pandemic was a death dealer, and when it struck, fear and confusion reigned. People were guessing at how to protect themselves, how to recover when it struck their home, and trying to find patterns between those who survived and those who did not. Most of us lost someone, or knew someone who did, and the grief and panic from that period still affects us. Grief is a part of life and can be associated with shame, and all of us at some level have to function as death doulas, or people who help others transition during the final moments of life. The title for this episode is Death Dealer and Death Doula, COVID-19 and the Monster of Grief. I'm Dr. Seth Pierce, and welcome back to Beast and Bible. Natasha, thank you so much for coming on Beast and Bible.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Your new book, Shattered Grief: How the Pandemic Transformed Death and Spirituality, came out this year. Can you share an overview of the project and a few teaser takeaways for listeners who I would hope want to purchase the book? It's such a cool topic.
Yeah, this book is obviously very far afield from my work in Tibetan studies. During the pandemic, like many people, I lost a friend and colleague to COVID-19. And that's kind of where this research project begins. I was actually watching his funeral on my phone during like the height of the pandemic. Yeah. And that kind of got me thinking about how the ways that we grieve and the ways that we honor the dead were changing as a result of the pandemic. I always kind of joke that I know academics often are kind of notorious for never dealing with issues of real emotional vulnerability by just using the kind of shield of research. And I hope this book is a little different about that, because I ended up putting quite a bit of my own experience thinking through grief issues into this work. It was originally just going to be an article. I thought I'd email maybe 5 or 6, kind of cold email 5 or 6 religious professionals, just how were they changing funerals.
Right.
And the floodgates just opened when I started doing these interviews. Everyone wanted to talk to me. Every pastor or priest or rabbi had 3 or 4 parishioners that they really thought I needed to talk to. And pretty soon it ballooned into about 100 hours of recorded interviews with people from January 2021 to August 2021. So I always say the interviews start just when vaccinations are starting to roll out, but it's before we get the kind of rise of post-vaccination COVID. Yeah. And interviews with everyone involved with the American cycle of death. So there's religious professionals and medical professionals and those who are grieving loved ones, but also spirit mediums and death doulas and funerary professionals who have to make decisions on what bodies that they can process and how they're going to touch and interact with those bodies. And so it's a really diverse.
So there's a term you mentioned, and I've got several questions about that. What is a death doula? That's probably a term that many listeners have not.
Yeah. A death doula is someone who, in the same way that a birth doula is there to kind of advocate for the mother and to advocate to kind of help this person make a lot of very difficult decisions at a time when they're often in a lot of pain or not always in a place to make those decisions themselves. A death doula does that for someone as they're dying. And so a death doula might be hired by a family near the end of death when someone has a terminal illness and knows that they are maybe only have a year to live and are trying to figure out how to process this traumatic grief with their family. It can also be hired by a family after the funeral, or along the way of the funeral, someone to help process grief and to kind of create significance around someone's passing. I think they're not very accepted. I do believe I've heard from people in the field that there are more death doulas than there are people who want to hire death doulas, but hopefully that is something that will change as a kind of acknowledgement of the importance of kind of more holistic ways of handling death is becoming more common.
This leads into a dynamic I think we saw intensified during COVID, and that is grief, loss. That's a monster in and of itself. And of course, every culture deals with it differently. But for a lot of people, I want to avoid it, don't want to think about it. It's painful, scary. I'm just going to pretend something didn't happen. So from your perspective, especially having done this research, how does grief or could grief be considered a monster for people, a type of monster?
I think it could, especially when that grief is unacknowledged. A lot of with shared grief, and again, it's a snapshot. This book is a snapshot of a very specific time. But during that time, a lot of people felt that their grief was not being acknowledged by a larger American society because of the politicization of the pandemic, because of conspiracy theory about was the pandemic even happening, but also because people were in a real hurry to get back to normal, and people really wanted, once we got the vaccination, there's a real effort to try to forget this ever happened, or to say certain deaths were just an acceptable statistic, that there were so many, someone's loved one had comorbidities, and that's the reason that they passed from COVID, not that there was a completely novel virus that no one knew how to combat. And I think a lot of cultures recognize this. Well, that grief in itself can be a monster. When I was recently in China, we went to this place. It was called the Fengdu Ghost City, and it's basically kind of a half temple, half amusement park based around hell. And so you go through the temple, but as you're going through the temple, you're basically making offerings, but almost recreating what your journey is going to be as you die. And so there's all sorts of kind of like funny cartoons, and there's like one incredible display where you sit on top of an LED screen, and it's like all around you, and you see your soul getting tortured and going through all these different places.
Super intense.
It is. Yeah. It was really intense. But there's a woman at the end of the whole thing called Mengpo. And she supposedly she collects the tears of everyone grieving around the world and turns them into a soup that you drink so that you forget everything that happened to you before your next life. And in some versions of her story, she's actually the heroine of this very famous love story in China, where her husband is forced to go do labor and build the Great Wall of China, and he dies in the process, and she goes to go recover the body, and it's buried in the wall itself. And so she's unable to forget her husband and forget her grief. So she gathers the tears of those who are grieving to help them forget their loved ones. I think that's really beautiful and poetic.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's similar, not as traumatic. This might be a really bad comparison. This is just what popped into my head. But I look at some of the Hell House and Judgment House that evangelicals do to kind of take people through, and I do not appreciate them at all. but I think the goal, trying to acquaint people with the realities of death, probably in an extremely traumatic way. And what this sounds like is more almost like a type of memento mori, type of hey, we're going to confront death, we're going to go through, but trying to offer some sort of healing narrative, not just like traumatizing people, like, oh, you're in hell and here's some fire, but more weaving it into a narrative that ends a little bit more gently than maybe what some of the American Christian versions of that would be.
Yeah, I think because in a lot of the hell literature I translate, there is this kind of net message of the underlying kind of message is you better be good or else you will end up in hell. Of course, Buddhist hells, though, are not permanent the way many hells are in Christianity. So it's still, you're only going to be in hell for like 1,000 years being tortured. But this did not have that, because it didn't have the idea of, well,
you don't do that, you're responsible, and you're
So, and there was also, there's also this element of like people dressed up that you would take photos with, and like they were selling like little swords and things. So a lot of kids were running around with swords, pretending
very
to be
different
hell
vibe.
guard.
Yeah. So as you research the subject, as you're going through this 100 hours of just interviewing different people, were there any insights that really influenced you personally in terms of how you process grief?
I think a lot of the people, because of about the 20 or 24 people I interviewed who were grieving the loss of loved one to COVID-19, it became really clear the people that were processing their grief well. It didn't matter if you were religious or not religious or anything, or what religion you were, but what happened was the people who were able to kind of make significance to make a story or a narrative around their grief seemed to be in a better place with their grieving than those that were not. And there's a scholar, Hayden White's talking about this thing called emplotment, and it got used by Paul Ricoeur, to think about ideas of the self. This idea that ourselves are barely just stories, that we tell ourselves a story about ourselves.
Natasha likes to give her students an example of going out and relating the evening and subsequent events to a friend in a very wooden and disjointed manner. You could say, I went to a restaurant, then next weekend I went on a date, and then I proposed to my date a month later. Again, that feels pretty clinical and wooden, Instead, we usually say something like, yeah, I didn't feel like going out, but my friend made me. And while we were out, I met this amazing lady and we started talking. She decided to sit with us. And then the next thing I knew, I asked her out. We went on a date the following weekend, and so on.
Like you kind of make a narrative about that moves things from being in just pieces of linear time, but to actually one thing causes the next, and there's a significance to the story. You have a better narrative about yourself. And I found that people that were able to do that with their grief, being like, this was terrible to lose my father, but at least he was able to die at home and I was able to be with him. And this is actually for the best in these ways. Or it was terrible to lose my mother, but I have grown this much because of it. And I feel like I have been given this gift of life because if you're able to make a narrative around your grief, I found that actually those people grieved differently or seem to be having more successful grief. So I've been thinking a lot about that just in my own life, of just the importance of the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and how that can affect the way we think.
Reminds me of Walter Fisher's idea of homo narrans, like we are by nature storytelling creatures. That's how we live and exist in the world. And yeah, when we hit something like COVID-19, when there's no information or not as much information as we want, we kind of implode and people become more open to a variety of stories just to fill in that gap with something to make meaning. We don't do real well when it's like, I don't know, this thing happened and I've got no explanation for it.
And I think that's a lot of why conspiracy theory really thrived during the pandemic, because we had a certain story that, oh, this wedding that I'm planning to go to next month is definitely going to happen. I can plan dinner for tomorrow night and know that the restaurant's going to be open. And just like any story, everything just imploded. And so people began finding other narratives to try to make sense of what was at some level a completely senseless time.
Yeah.
I also found a lot of value in the book's divided into 4 different chapters looking at how certain foundational ideas in religious studies changed as a result of the encounter with death during the pandemic. And one was the idea of trauma. And trauma is really understudied, and I think to some sense underutilized in academic work on religion. But all of my research informants talked about the trauma that they experienced, even those that were handling their grief relatively well. And so I found a lot of value in thinking through Robert Orsi's ideas of phenomenology of disgust. And he hasn't written too much about this in peer-reviewed work, but he wrote about it for the Harvard Alumni Magazine, discussing his disgust as he's working right now on a research project involving Catholic sex abuse victims. And his nurturing this kind of phenomenology of disgust of the institution that wronged them, but saying that he argues that this is foundational to religion. Whether or not every scholar wants to do that is kind of up for grabs. But what I really saw him saying was that it's okay as a scholar to look at your material and to first just feel like a human. That I don't have to be a scholar first. I can be disgusted with churches that were ripping people's masks off from the pulpit, or churches that said Jesus would say only all lives matter, or with synagogues and communities that say you're not a real Jew. I know one of my research informants, who was a funeral director, was told that she wasn't a real Jew because she wouldn't let these Jewish ceremonies that involved washing a COVID positive body. She didn't want those to happen for obvious reasons. Yeah. And she was told that you have forsaken your Jewish identity for this.
Wow.
And so I found that Robert Orsi's ideas of phenomenology of disgust really let me say, this is horrifying that this happened, and that I could feel emotionally first before I had to become an academic and analyze. And
yeah, and I think that's shifted a lot too. I know, like in ethnographic studies or participant observer studies, where this passionate ivory tower, unfeeling scholar, you kind of recognize like, no, I can. There's certain structures I can use to try to be as objective as possible. But at the end of the day, I'm a human being, and I feel my way through the world probably more than I want to admit in terms of like how I think my way through the world. And I think it's good for us, whatever we're studying, to feel it. These are real people, real lives. If I'm unaffected by it, I think it's important to care about the people you're working with.
Of course.
Thinking in terms of this research you've done, how it shifted religious conversations post-pandemic. I know institutions all over the place were impacted by COVID in a variety of ways. Education has been changing. And so this is kind of $1 million question. I think for anyone working in humanities or religion, theology, there was a meme flowing around this week going back to the Olympics when the big sort of moral panic over the opening ceremonies, where it was this, sorry you didn't take your humanities class, and kind of deconstructing what was actually going on. And I don't want to open that whole mess and try to leave that conversation behind. But a lot of colleges and universities prize STEM courses over humanities, and religion, even in private institutions, faith-based institutions, doesn't always get top billing from marketing, or we're going to advertise our business classes, our nursing classes, maybe whatever they are. And so I think for both people who teach in this area and students. What practical value is there in studying religion and theology, and how might we share that with the wider community?
Yeah, I think I usually have two answers to this question because at Texas State University, we are very small. Our religious studies major is a very tiny little major. So we're constantly trying to justify ourselves to our university administration. I think there's really two answers. The first is, of course, just sheer kind of knowledge and ability to address difference. So this is going to be as simple as knowing not to bring pork ribs to your Jewish friend's barbecue, or as complex as understanding, kind of having some idea of what Shia and Sunni mean and why these two communities might have a history of being upset with each other, or maybe don't have a history, or kind of why the complexity of these ideas. So that's very practical information that students can take away and use. And the skills, even if they don't have the specific information, hopefully by taking these classes, they will know how to ascertain accurate information from inaccurate. And if they encounter someone that they don't know anything about, that they will understand how best to find out more information about this person's community. So that's a very practical answer. I also think there's a second value though to this. I've been really inspired by Tyler Roberts' book called Encountering Religion, where he talks about the value of religious studies is a kind of structured encounter with the other. And that religious studies is unique as a field because it produces these encounters between individuals, often around the thing that they are most sensitive or is most vital or is most intimate to that person, or is the most beyond expression, the most complicated and hard to try to kind of suss out. And so that religious studies classrooms are unique in making this encounter, but also helping students structure a response to that, helping students think about, what do I do when someone has completely different views from me? How do I make sense of that, or how to understand that? And I think that's a really valuable idea. And part of that is, as we were just talking about, he wants to throw away this idea of the objective academic he doesn't want a theology classroom where people are trying to argue about the correct way to interpret, but he wants to produce a place where people acknowledge that a scholar is coming at this with this type of background, or that their previous encounters and responses took place in this type of way. And I think that's very, very valuable.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's awesome. And very practical. I think that as we get more and more connected, especially with digital technology, where it's inevitable, you're going to run into people in any field who think differently, believe differently, to not be ignorant in terms of where they're coming from, to know how to communicate with them, to know how to be sensitive around issues, and even maybe to have spaces that are a little open to transcendence and the other, versus putting everything in a neat box is important. Natasha, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And if our listeners want to connect with you and your work, what's the best way to do that?
You can find me. I do have an academic website that I made myself. So they can go find me at www.hellscholar.com. But they can also, if they type in, my last name's very unique, so I'm pretty sure they can just find me that way too.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All of us tell stories to make sense of tragedy and grief. The reality is sometimes we don't have a good explanation or a neat framework to process what happens. In the Gospels, Jesus reflects on two tragedies in Luke 13. One where some Galileans have their blood mixed with sacrifices by Pilate, and the other where a tower in Siloam falls on some random people. Instead of giving a neat cause and effect explanation, Jesus just challenges us to be ready because we don't know when our last day will be. Not having an explanation for tragedy doesn't mean we're dumb, it just means life is messy, and that we get caught up in the mess sometimes. And that doesn't mean our loved ones who we lose, or that stable life we once had, was meaningless or didn't matter. From a Christian perspective, it also doesn't mean our suffering and pain doesn't matter to God either. The Gospels remind us that the hairs on our head are numbered. What we do and who we are matters to God and is counted. That's comforting when grief and fear make us feel alone and unworthy. In times where we don't have the answers we want, it's important to find safe people and communities to process these things with, and to acquire good resources like Dr. Mikles' book. I am also intrigued by the idea of a death doula. Part of me thinks this kind of an idea should be emphasized among clergy, who are often called into the shadows of other people's lives as they come to a close. Finally, as we close this episode, I recently stumbled across an interview clip from J.R.R. Tolkien that speaks to this subject. Tolkien, arguably one of the finest storytellers to ever walk the earth, has a lot to say about death, darkness, and monsters. And my next guest happens to be an expert not only in Tolkien's work, but the faith that guided it. Plan to tune in for an insightful tour of Middle-earth. Thanks for listening. Stay blessed, beasties.
Beast and Bible is written, researched, produced, and hosted by Dr. Seth Pierce. Ethan Geck is our editor. Logo design and social media by Chelsea Ernina. Equipment and tech help from the dynamic duo James Gigante and Stephen Husett. Producing and project help from me, Heather Moore. Thanks for listening to Beast and Bible. Tell your friends about us, and don't forget to leave a nightlight on after dark.